What's going on? Welcome to the Blue Shoes Fitness Podcast, where we talk about strength training, nutrition, faith, family, and how all of those things work together for parents like you and me. My name is Coach Jay, and today I want to give you some more practical programming help when it comes to piecing together a workout plan that meets all of your needs as a parent. If you want to build a body that is balanced both in ability and in appearance, the simple blueprint that we'll discuss in a few moments will be a great place to start. But first, let's start off with our verse of the week, which I'm going to be reading out of Colossians chapter 3, verses 15 through 17. It says, "Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you were called to peace, and be thankful. Let the message of Christ dwell among you richly as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom through psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your hearts. And whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him." The book of Colossians, which originally was a letter to a church in Colossae, uh, is a very, I would say, feel good sort of letter. And in particular, chapter 3, which I just read from here, is a real uplifting, encouraging chapter if you are ever in need of some uplifting encouragement for the day or for the week or for your season of life. And I think it's uplifting, not just because it's all rainbows and butterflies and sunshine and all that kind of stuff, but there's some real practical advice and commands in here that really do lead to the peace of Christ that this passage opens up with. It's not just a matter of trying to tell ourselves that everything is going to be all right if we don't actually believe that everything's going to be all right, or thinking that everything's going to be all right by way of placing our hope in things that will ultimately let us down, which Jesus is the only thing, the only person that's worth putting our hope in. And this passage kind of speaks to that too. Some of the practical things that it talks about of being thankful, of letting this message and this truth of Christ that we so often talk about, let it dwell among you richly. I love that imagery there. And as you teach and admonish one another. So this is about the actual truth and teaching that to one another and learning from one another. This is not an emotionally driven message. This is not a message that's based on tradition. This is based on what's actually true in the reality that we live in and in the reality that's to come from an eternal standpoint too. And then it talks about, again, gratitude in our hearts. And then the final verse of this, which is the kind of capstone that people tend to either get tattooed or a verse of the week sort of phrase, is, "And whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him." So that's definitely a feel-good section of scripture if you ever need that, or if you need that for today. All right, today's topic, let's get right into it. The 6 major movement patterns to include in your training. So a few episodes ago, I talked about building out your own workout plan. And one of the ways that you can go about doing that, or I should say one of the critical steps in doing that, is choosing the exercises that you're going to fill in the program with. And that's kind of the big boots on the ground. Once you get all of this theory stuff out of the way, once you get all of the goals that you want to achieve or pursue, once you get all of those kind of things grounded, then you go, okay, how do we actually bridge the gap between goals and results? And one of the ways that you can do this is by filling in the gaps with exercises and choosing those exercises based off of the different muscle groups that you want to train. And something that I mentioned in that episode was that for most people, and I would say most beginners, but maybe even just most people too, training, it's gonna make sense to equally spread out your training volume across all your different muscle groups, meaning that you just make a list of different muscle groups. You talk about your deltoids, which are your shoulders. You talk about your pecs, your biceps, triceps, your quads, hamstrings, glutes, all of those, some of those major muscle groups, and of course, all the ones on your upper and middle back too. And you kind of just go, okay, we're just going to do pretty even work across all of them. We're going to do, I don't know, 3 sets of 10 across exercises that are going to reach each of those muscle groups. And I would say for most people, it makes sense to start there. And for a lot of people, it really doesn't make a ton of sense to get further specialized in that regard unless you have specific goals that are related to prioritizing specific muscle groups. Meaning that if you have a specific muscle group that you want to build up, either by way of or either for an aesthetic reason or a performance reason, then you can totally do that. You can do more training volume or more work for that muscle group by way of the exercises that you're going to be using. So that's one way that you can go about doing this, is by choosing exercises based on the muscle group. So you make a big chart of saying, here, my shoulders, and then here's a big list of exercises for my shoulders. You do the same thing with your quads, same thing with your glutes, and so on and so forth. But there is something that you might miss out on if that's the only criteria that you use for being able to choose the exercises that you're going to use for your workout program. For example, the shoulders, your deltoids. So your entire shoulder joint and shoulder girdle is highly functional, meaning it has many different functions. It does not just, your shoulders do not just move in one direction. Think about your elbows, how your elbows primarily flex and extend. They primarily bend and straighten. There's not really any sort of rotation that actually happens at your elbow joint. You can rotate your forearm, you can pronate and supinate your forearm, but that's not happening at your elbow joint. That's the crossing over of your two forearm bones. And so you think about your shoulders move in all sorts of directions. They move forward, they move backward, they move upward and downward. You can actually shrug them upward and pull them downward. You can kind of do these like, shoulder rolls and shoulder circles, both forward and backward. They do all sorts of different functions. And if you just go, okay, I'm going to reduce that entire joint to your primary shoulder muscle being your deltoids. And if you just go, okay, I'm going to hit my deltoids, and you list out a bunch of different exercises, you may not actually be training that muscle to its full potential. One of the things, let's just say an example of an overhead press, that's a very typical shoulder exercise that you might say, okay, on a shoulder day or an upper body day, I'm going to do an overhead press. Whether you're using a barbell or dumbbells, you're pressing upward. And that motion is going to be great, especially for your front delts, especially for the frontal head of your shoulders. But you're going to be missing out on all of the other functions that your shoulders perform if that's the only way that you approach training your shoulders. One of the big examples of that being is that your shoulders also move horizontally. It's not just a vertical thing, it's a horizontal thing. So think about, you're not going to be including any sort of programming that's going to load your shoulders by pushing forward or by pulling backward. And so, in on the backward side of it too, you think about your shoulders, and a lot of times we think about pressing. We think about pressing upward or maybe pressing outward, but the different heads of your shoulders will also uh, laterally raise your arms, and they'll also pull your upper arms backward too. And that's how we kind of get divisions with like the frontal head of your delts versus the lateral head versus the rear head, or the posterior head. And so like you get all of these different ways of dividing out shoulder training, and you go, wow, I wonder if that applies to any other joints too, any other muscle groups. And another big example, think about sort of the lower body equivalent of your shoulders would be your hips. Your hips also move in many different directions. They are nearly as flexible and as mobile as your shoulders are, as far as they don't just move forward and backward or in and out. And they do all of those things together, and they can rotate inside and outside. And so you have all of these different movements, and you start going, okay, if I just approach my training by way of deciding which exercises I'm going to use based off of the muscle groups themselves, then you might be missing out on some of those there too. And so, if we kind of reverse engineer this a little bit and we start looking at the movement patterns that your different joints can accomplish, or that your different muscle groups can accomplish, then each muscle group will naturally be worked in one degree or another if we start with that. So rather than starting with the muscle groups and then hoping that we're able to prioritize, all the different movement patterns, if we swap that and we go, let's start with the movement patterns, which that's what we're talking about here, the 6 major movement patterns that you can include in your training. If we start with those, then we'll know that we're going to hit every muscle group in one way or another. So here's the gist of the setup of today's episode is I have a list here of the 6 major movement patterns to include in your training, and I have a list of honorable mentions to follow that up too, because there is not, this is purely, I hesitate to say purely, but I want to emphasize that this is my opinion, and it's not purely my opinion in that these are some of the major patterns that you will see consistently from coach after coach of making lists like this. But you will get some coaches that will add certain things to it, and that's part of where that honorable mentions list comes in. So let me just run through all 6 of these here, and then I'll go back through and share exactly with some examples of them and exactly what that looks like. So the 6 major movement patterns to include in your training are: number 1, upper body vertical push. Number 2, upper body vertical pull. Number 3, upper body horizontal push. Number 4, you can probably guess it, upper body horizontal pull. Number 5 is a lower body squat. And number 6 is a lower body hinge. So these 6 patterns, if you think about pressing upward, pulling downward, pressing outward, pulling backward, squatting, and hinging, this is going to constitute the vast majority of exercises that you will see in a gym environment. This will constitute the majority of just basic movement patterns that you use on a regular basis, though the versions that you'll be using in your workouts will probably be more rigid and more consistent than the versions that you do at home. You might not do a full butt to the ground sort of squat every time that you need to sit down on something, or you're not going to do a full hinge anytime you need to bend over and pick something up. But these patterns they constitute the main ways that your body moves on a regular basis, and in the gym is specifically what we're talking about here in your strength and hypertrophy training. So let's go back through that list here. So number 1, upper body vertical push. A great example of this is an overhead press, just like I was talking about a moment ago. So upper body, that much is fairly obvious here. Vertical, going upward, and pushing. So you're pressing upward or pushing upward. And an overhead press is exactly what this motion is. And that's going to be primarily working your deltoids, so your shoulders, just like we talked about, as well as your triceps. And talking about movement patterns here and muscle groups, one of the other things that you can think about is joint actions too. So anytime that a joint of your body is moving, so in this case, your shoulder is moving and your elbows are moving, you can think about that those joints are moving because of the muscles that are attached to them. And so from there, you can figure out which muscle groups are working to be able to move those joints, whether it's to flex those joints or to extend those joints. So an overhead press is going to primarily work your deltoids and your triceps. And by extension, any kind of upper body vertical pushing movement is probably also going to work those same 2 primary muscle groups. The opposite of that action, that movement, is pulling downward, and pulling downward in a vertical fashion. So number 2, the movement pattern is upper body vertical pull. So you think about what we just talked about of pressing upward. So pulling downward in this case, maybe an overhead pull down, or you might see it as a lat pull down. This is going to work all of the opposite muscle groups, if you want to think about it that way, of being your lats and maybe your traps and your biceps on your arms. This is going to be a great example of, a pure vertical pull. Number 3, upper body horizontal push. So this is likely going to do some of the same muscle groups by way of the fact that it's a pushing based exercise, but because we're doing it horizontally, think about a push-up or a bench press, where similar movement pattern where your hands are starting close to your body and you are pressing away from yourself, either by way of pushing the weight up and away from you or by pushing yourself up off the ground like in a push-up. You're still going to be using your deltoids, you're still going to be using your triceps, but now that you're using a horizontal pushing pattern, you'll likely be getting your pecs involved as well. And so this is something that if you only ever did vertical pushing, you might be missing out on pec development as well. And, to your credit on this, if you're listening to this, maybe you've never really had a specific goal around your pecs. Maybe that's not something, the big flat muscle on your chest. Maybe that's not something that you've really ever specifically prioritized or thought about. But thinking about a joint that is as complex as your shoulder, and we can go down the rabbit hole on this, but from a very surface level point of view, I think it makes sense to think of balancing out the pushing and pulling and compressive and tensile forces that go into your joints, especially things like your shoulders, where you have muscles that are attached all around your shoulder joint. And so if you only ever train 1 or 2 of these patterns around your shoulders, but totally neglect a muscle group that's going to be helping with a different muscle or a different movement pattern, then you might end up with some pretty wonky shoulder mobility issues. And I don't say that as a scare tactic. I don't think that's something that a lot of people have to worry about, because if you're building out or following a workout plan, then you probably won't have these huge gaps in your training. But if you just straight up never did any horizontal pushing, for example, you probably wouldn't build up your pecs very much. And you think about, if you were to take a look at an anatomy chart of where your pecs attach to your upper body, as well as into your sternum, You might be missing out on some strength for not only that movement pattern, but thinking about just from a postural point of view too, of what that would do to your shoulders and your overall posture. So this is why I think looking at a movement pattern based way of putting together a workout plan can be a really helpful thing to do, so that you don't end up with these big, gaping holes in your training. So that was number three, upper body horizontal push. The opposite of pressing outward would be pulling backward. So this is number four, our upper body horizontal pull. A great example of this is something like a seated row, or really any kind of a row variation, where you are pulling backward. So you're pulling your shoulder blades backward, you're pulling your elbows backward, and by way of extension of all of that, that your hands are going to be coming inward toward you. And this is going to work primarily your lats and your traps and your rear delts and your biceps. So you can think about the pushing based exercise. If you think about a push pull legs split, if you've heard that term, you can think about pushing as primarily being your delts, your pecs, your triceps. Those are going to be the muscles that are going to be involved with pushing or pressing away from you. And the opposite is going to be true of whether you're pulling downward vertically or pulling backward horizontally. Your pulling based exercises are primarily going to be hitting your lats and your traps and your rear delts and your biceps. And so you kind of have equivalent muscles on the front side of your body as you do with the back side. And all of the backside muscles are going to be pulling backward. They're going to be pulling downward. And then your front side muscles are going to be doing kind of the opposite of that. And so any kind of a row variation is going to be great for the hitting the horizontal pulling category for your upper body. Getting into the lower body here, we have two main delineations here, and one of them being the squat pattern. And this much is probably pretty obvious of, what does a squat pattern look like as far as what's an example of an exercise? Let's just pick one. Let's say a barbell back squat, for example. You have the barbell sat up on top of either your shoulders or a little bit lower on your upper traps, kind of on that shelf for low bar squats like I typically do. No matter where that bar is, you are going to be doing a squat pattern where you're going to be getting a lot of flexion and extension in your hips as well as your knees. So again, taking a look at the joints, we can figure out which muscles are attached to those that are going to be causing that movement. And that's primarily going to be your quads, which are the big muscles on the front of your legs, on your upper legs, and then your glutes, which everybody knows what your glutes are. And so that's what a squat pattern is typically going to work. If you are moving your hips and your knees in that movement pattern, you will be working those muscles. However, you can bias to what degree you are working your quads versus your glutes by how you set up your squat, by the squat variation, and there's a lot of factors that go into that as well. But a squat-based pattern that's primarily going to cover your quads and glutes. A hinge-based pattern, which is our sixth movement pattern of your lower body hinge, this is going to be something like a Romanian deadlift, where you are almost exclusively moving at your hips. So your knees are doing very little movement. And of course, there's a lot of variation in on this here, but just taking a look at like the Romanian deadlift as being kind of a poster child for the hip hinge movement, that because you're going to be working or moving at the hips, taking a look at the muscles that are connected to your hips, that's going to be your glutes and your hamstrings. And depending on to what degree your knees are moving, to what degree your hips are moving relative to your knees, relative to your torso angle, and all those kinds of things, you might be biasing more of your glutes, or you might be biasing more of your hamstrings. And so that's going to be that sixth pattern there for the hinge. You might be thinking of some other patterns as well too, and I'll talk about those here in just a moment with the honorable mentions here of some other things that you might see here. But taking a look at these six movement patterns here, if you take a look at any sort of workout program, whether it's one that you've put together in the past, whether it's something that you're following right now that you've done online, if you see somebody online and just posting exercises that they're doing, you might be able to start piecing together, oh, okay, so this exercise that they're doing fits into one of these movement pattern categories here. And by way of including all six of these patterns, which I don't know if that sounds like a lot, or if that sounds intimidating at all to go, oh my gosh, I have to fit in all 6 of these things in every workout and all this. First of all, that's not what I'm saying. But across the course of your workout plan, so whether it's in every workout, if you're doing like a full body workout, or if you have a split where you're doing maybe an upper body day and a lower body day, or you're doing a vertical day and a horizontal day, or a push day and a pull day, or push pull legs, or whatever your split looks like, you will likely cover most, if not all of these, just naturally. And so that's something that I want you to take into consideration, is to look at whatever program it is that you're doing, or however it is that you approach your workouts, and go, okay, am I covering all 6 of these bases in my workout program? Now, you might find that some of the exercises that you're most familiar with don't fit into any of these perfectly. And so that's where some of these honorable mentions come in. And so I had the 6 major movement patterns that I think are worth including in your training program. And then I have 5 honorable mentions that I want to share with you here. The first one, which kind of follows off with right where we left off, we talked about lower body squats, we talked about lower body hinges. And if you take a second to think about this, if this is a world that you're kind of familiar with, you might think of one more lower body pattern that is like a big deal from a trendy Instagram sort of point of view, and that's going to be the lower body bridge based pattern. So a hinge is exactly what it sounds like. Think of a deadlift where you are hinging at your hips, and a bridge based pattern is going to be something like a glute bridge or a hip thrust. You might think of like a barbell hip thrust, where you have a barbell across your hips and you are trying to squeeze your glutes and contract your glutes as hard as possible to be able to raise that bar up off the ground. This pattern is primarily, as the name glute bridge would maybe suggest, is that it's primarily going to be for your glutes. And the reason why that's the case is because you're moving at your hip joint, which we already talked about is going to be largely associated with your glutes. And because your knees are going to be bent, and whether it's at a perfect 90-degree angle or a little bit more or a little bit less, your hamstrings are not going to be in a great position to really provide much of any kind of force to be able to lift that bar up or that weight up, whatever it is that you're using. Whereas in a hinge based movement, which is going to be a kind of lengthened overloaded movement, where your glutes are lengthening as you're hinging over, and you're trying to that's going to be the hardest part of that movement, is when they're most lengthened. The bridge based position is going to be the opposite, where at the top of the hip thrust, where your glutes are most shortened, that's where that's going to be the hardest. And so this is definitely going to be a shortened position exercise for the glutes. That might be something that would be worth adding to this list. If you had to add a 7th movement pattern, that might be a 7th one that you might add on to there. However, the second honorable mention one that I'm going to list is probably the one that, if you look up like major movement patterns for training, you will probably see the second honorable mention listed on nearly every coach's like every kind of like functional training coach's page, and that's going to be the carry. You might see lists that are like push, pull, squat, hinge, carry. And carry is a big one. So it's exactly what it sounds like, of carrying heavy loads, something like a farmer's carry, where you might have a heavy dumbbell in each hand and you are just walking. And a set of farmer's carries might look like you pick up whatever the weight is, and then you walk 20 or 30 steps, or maybe you walk 10 or 15 or 20 yards. Your reps are going to be measured in distance rather than just normal repetitions. Carries like these are going to be great for grip strength. And that's a big reason why a lot of people will do the carry. And they're going to be great for your traps as well, too. If you have never done the farmer's carry, where you just pick up 2 heavy weights, basically as heavy as you can grasp, and then you just walk for distance with those, and then maybe you rest for a few minutes, and then you do another set. Your traps will be more sore than anything that you've ever done if you have not done this before. And that, of course, is not equated to that just purely being effective. The soreness level is not a 1-to-1 ratio of effectiveness level, but it will tell you that, oh, you were working that muscle and you were working it pretty hard. So that's going to be a reason why you might see the carry. The carry is probably going to show up on a lot of those lists, because this is something that we do on a regular basis. We carry heavy things, and whether it's perfectly loaded, 20 pounds in one hand, 20 pounds in the other, you might have 2 children, maybe they weigh differently, and you're holding them under your arms and in each arm. This is a movement pattern that we use on a regular basis. Or my favorite, or the one that I tend to use the most, is going to be like carrying in groceries. I'm one of those one trip people. And that ends up being a great way to be able to practice carries in that regard too. So the carry is another honorable mention on this here. The third honorable mention for movement patterns is rotational based movements. This is something that is missing from the 6 major movement patterns that I listed. That doesn't necessarily mean that the 6 movement patterns are incomplete, but rotational based movements where you are physically rotating your body. You think about all of these other movements that we've talked about that are going to be the most common in your workout pattern, in your workouts. Those are going to be all moving up and down or forward and backward. There's nothing in regard to that talks anything about rotational movement. So you think about rotation in terms of a lot of like core and abdominal exercises. One of my favorites being a 10-to-2 rotation. So whether you're using a band or a cable, setting it up at about shoulder height and thinking as if you're standing at the middle of a clock and you're holding it at the 10 o'clock position and you're rotating over to about 2 o'clock and then vice versa for the other side, 2 to 10. This movement pattern is largely going to be working your obliques across the sides of your abs. So both your internal and external abdominal obliques. The fourth honorable mention is a little bit of a take on any one of the 6 that we talked about earlier, and that's going to be a unilateral version of any of these patterns here. Unilateral exercises can be great from a stability and balance point of view. Certain exercises are going to be easier just by practical standards of setting them up unilaterally. Some of them just might be more fun to be able to do as well too, and you might enjoy unilateral exercises as well. Something like a vertical push, our very first movement pattern. We use the overhead press as an example. You could do this with one arm at a time. You could do a single arm overhead press. From a squat based pattern, a unilateral version of this would look like a lunge or a split squat, maybe a reverse lunge, for example. That would be a great way to be able to still work your quads and glutes in a squat based pattern, but you might be able to dig a little deeper into that and to be able to get a little bit of a bigger stretch on one side versus another. You might be able to bias one joint over another. You might be able to work on your mobility a little bit more than just a squat by itself. So that might be some reasons to be able to include some unilateral stuff in your training. And then something like the carry that I just talked about a second ago, if you have your farmer's carry, you might consider just doing what's called a suitcase carry, where instead of picking up 2 heavy, equally sized weights in your hands, you might just pick up one of those. And you can imagine that you are now going to be thrown way off balance if your body is if you're not holding it perfectly upright. And so this is going to be challenging your obliques on the opposite side of the weight that you're holding. And then the last honorable mention that I want to share with you here is you might think of looking at these main movement patterns and thinking, my biceps curls and triceps extensions don't really seem to fit in any of those. Maybe you think about you are curling up the weight and you're pulling it up vertically. So maybe it kind of fits in the vertical pull for a biceps curl, or maybe your triceps extensions fit in the vertical push. But your single joint exercises are going to be another honorable mention for this list here that you will probably do in a lot of your training, unless you're doing just strictly like powerlifting based movements or Olympic lifting or things like that. But if you have any interest in overall strength and hypertrophy training, single joint exercises can be a great way to be able to add some training volume to specific muscle groups without drastically increasing your levels of fatigue. And this can be a great way to be able to prioritize some of those extra muscle groups that you want to specifically work on too. This is going to, most of these single joint exercises, there are a lot of them, but a lot of them that you're going to be familiar with are going to involve your elbow. So elbow flexion and extension, like I said, a biceps curl, triceps extension, any variation on those 2 patterns there. They're also going to revolve a lot around your knees and doing knee flexion and knee extension, something like a hamstring curl or leg curl, whether it's a seated curl or a lying curl, kneeling curl, lots of variations on that. Same thing with a leg extension or a knee extension based exercise. Those are all going to be surrounding your knee. And those single joint exercises can be a great addition to these 6 main patterns here that I talked about. So that's all I have for you on this here. And I was really excited to share this episode with you because this is one of the ways that I I still use just pen and paper when I'm putting together client programs. Even in the Strong Shepherds program, I start with a blank piece of paper and I make a chart that says upper body vertical push, upper body vertical pull, horizontal push, horizontal pull, squat and hinge, and fill in all the gaps. And I take a look at, am I missing any major pieces of this? And then from there, I might move into some of the some of the honorable mentions that I just mentioned there too, to be able to fill in some of the gaps or to add some pizzazz to it as well. So I'll leave you with that. Thanks so much for listening to today's episode, and I'll just leave you with that. I'm not going to get cut off like I did on the last episode. So I'm Coach Jay. Thanks for hanging with me, and we'll see you next time.